All right, welcome back. And we are now going to move into some of the intellectual influences on Herbert Spencer. There were many, but there are just a few that I wanted to mention because they relate directly to the way that Herbert Spencer understood the idea of evolution, especially social evolution. So the first guy is actually I think I called him Robert Malthus before. His name isn't Robert Malthus. His name is Thomas Malthus. Actually, his middle name is Robert, so I wasn't off by much. His name is Thomas Robert Malthus. Okay, and in 1798 he wrote a piece called "Essay on the Principle of Population." So some of you guys that are in my theory class also are in environmental sociology, and so you remember us talking about Robert Malthus in environmental sociology. Now, it's from Malthus that Herbert Spencer gets the idea of survival of the fittest, because the way that Malthus talked about this in his essay on population is he's really trying to describe population dynamics. Malthus is trying to describe population dynamics. And he said that as you recall, some of you maybe will recall, as populations increase geometrically, right? In other words, as they increase, the rate at which they increases. So they increase geometrically, right? But that resources can only increase arithmetically, like in a straight line. All right. So that means that at some point there is a gap, right, between population and the availability of resources to support that population. So population growth eventually outstrips resources, and it's from that whole idea that Spencer is going to get the notion that society is a competition, right? And in fact, because that's the way that Malthus sees nature, right? Nature is a competition for resources also. And so Spencer sees society as a competition for resources for basically the same reasons. This is where, it's from his reading of Malthus that Spencer's going to get the notion of survival of the fittest. Overpopulation would lead to survival of the fittest in Malthus's view, right? Because fertility, right? Fertility would stimulate activity. The more people there are, right? The more people there are, the more intelligence and the more ingenuity and other things like that are required to stay alive, right? So only the fit will survive, okay? Only the fit will survive. Only the fit will make it and thrive, right? And the unfit will fall away, okay? So that conflict for scarce goods would accelerate political and territorial conflicts to Spencer as well. That these would also shape internal social organization of a society. All right, so there's the influence of Thomas Malthus on Spencer. Another guy we get to was a philosopher named George Lewes, Lewes, a guy that lived from 1817 to 1878. And he was, also talking about evolution. And one of the things that he describes in his work is something called functional adaptation, right? So Spencer is going to be influenced by Lewis's or Lewes' idea of functional adaptation. And for Lewes, functional adaptation is the sole reason, the only reason, the only cause of development. Now, the way we understand functional adaptation, if we look at biology, right, is that it refers to the development of structures or the development of behaviors that increase the likelihood of survival. So maybe one example we could cite, right, of functional adaptation would be organisms living in a very, let's say, wet environment maybe are going to evolve the ability to produce a hard-shelled egg, right, that will provide more protection from their surroundings, okay, and therefore increase the likelihood of survival. So that would be, the development of that hard-shelled egg versus a soft-shelled egg or a softly encased egg would be an example of functional adaptation. Okay, everybody follow that, I hope. All right, hold on here just a second. Okay, another influence on Spencer's thought on social evolution was what he understood about biological evolution as well. So we can look at Spencer himself, right, and what Spencer understood about evolution. So back in 1864, Herbert Spencer wrote a book called Principles of Biology. And there are three principles that he takes from biology that he's going to apply to societies. And so the first one has to do with competition, right? So for him, societies and individuals emerge through competition. That's one principle. Another one is that evolution, right? Evolution in general, and the evolution of societies in particular, occurs through the interrelationship of functions. Okay, so we want to hold on to this idea again that we have, societies evolve from a condition of incoherence to a condition of coherence, right? And what that means is as they are becoming more coherent, they're evolving these specialized structures. And as they're evolving these specialized structures, the functions of those structures become much more integrated. They become much more interrelated. So the idea of the interrelation of functions, just like in an organism, the function of all the organs, the function of the heart and the function of the brain and the function of the digestive system and the immune system and all that are all interrelated. So the interrelationship of functions. And then the third thing that he derives from his understanding of biology is the differences between individuals and societies occur because of varying environmental conditions. In other words, as the environment changes, like in nature, as the environment changes, the organism becomes adapted to the environment. And he's saying the same thing about individuals and societies. As their environment changes, the individuals become adapted, right, to those conditions, those environmental conditions. And then I think one more thing we could say is, as a scientist, he's a scientist. He's a positivist. And as a scientist, he believes that there are laws. There are laws of nature and there are laws of society, and these laws explain social phenomena. But there was one guy who had a really important influence on Herbert Spencer, and that was a gentleman by the name of Carl von Baer. Okay, Carl von Baer said something really, really important about evolution, and I've kind of been talking like him. Like when I said that evolution involves the process of going from, incoherent to coherent, that's what Carl von Baer was talking about. So Carl von Baer's contribution was this idea of evolution involving a universal transformation from a condition of homogeneity to a condition of heterogeneity. And that's kind of like a mouthful, again. But the analog we could draw is to something like fetal development, human or any kind of fetal development. All right. So I have a little bit of art here for you. I'm not much of an artist, so don't laugh at me. But here's my diagram of a baby developing. Okay, so all the way. Let's see where I am here because this is like looking in a mirror. So I gotta get the right finger. So all the way over here, right? This is the zygote. All right, I'm sure you all know where babies come from. So, the sperm hits the egg and the egg starts to divide. So we have a zygote. And all that zygote is cells are dividing. Pop, 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 pop. And they're all dividing. You have this cluster of cells. Now think of that. They're all the same. All those cells, they look identical, right? So that's the condition of incoherence. That's the condition of homogeneity. It's just this big blob of cells. Right? And as those cells multiply, think about it like that, as the population of cells, right, gets bigger and bigger, then at some point that structures will begin to differentiate. So the next phase we go to, the one in the middle, that's my little artistic depiction of an embryo. Okay, so there's the embryo. Looks kind of like, I always think embryos look like commas or apostrophes. So there's our embryo, and then we start to see, like, first we start to see the beginning of the development of a nervous system and an eyeball, right? And then we get these little limb buds start to pop out, and then we start to detect a heartbeat, right? A circulatory system, and then eventually all the other organs begin to develop. So what's happening there is we're going from this condition of incoherence, right, to more toward a condition of coherence or heterogeneity, right? So we're moving from the blob here. We're moving from the blob here, right, to the embryo, to the fetus, right? And as we're moving toward the fetus, all these structures are developing, and they're all differentiating. Right? They're all becoming specialized in their function. So, like I said, I'm a terrible artist, so the best I could do for a fetus is I drew a little stick fetus for you with a little umbilical cord there. And I think that's a uterus, but I don't know. Okay, so there you go. That's it. So what we have in fetal development is a movement from incoherence to coherence, from homogeneity to heterogeneity. Okay, so evolution is a process of development from an incoherent, undifferentiated mass to differentiated and a coherent pattern, right? Differentiated and coherent patterns, in which the functions of structures become well coordinated. Okay, and we could say the same thing about a society. We get societies that are going to be very simple. There's going to be, like, if we look at, and we'll talk about this later on with Spencer, but if we had like a hunting and gathering society, this is a society which we would say is homogeneous, right? There's very little institutional specialization. There's a very, very low level of specialization of the division of labor. There's no specialized institution that coordinates everything like a government, or anything like that. Okay, so it is a homogeneous thing. It's a homogeneous thing, like that zygote, right? And if we were to add like population to it, as it got bigger, it would then begin to differentiate various structures, okay, and move us toward a social organism. So let's remember our definition of evolution, right? The way we defined evolution before, and I kind of just repeated myself without thinking about it, but the way we defined evolution before was we said, well, evolution is the process of development from incoherent, undifferentiated, Evolution is the process of development from an incoherent, undifferentiated mass to a differentiated and coherent pattern in which functions of structures are well coordinated, right? Now, in addition to understanding this idea of evolution, Spencer also understood that there was the possibility of the opposite of not just, not evolution, but de-evolution, or I think what he would call dissolution, right? Dissolution. And so dissolution is talking about movement the other way, right? Movement. Hold on. All right, I had to take a phone call. All right, so where was I? So evolution and dissolution. Right? So dissolution. Dissolution is basically the opposite. It describes a process where there is movement from a coherent and differentiated state to a homogeneous, incoherent mass, right? So de-differentiation, in other words. Okay. And we might have some examples of that in urban sociology, because let me do a little footnote. I'm going to do a little footnote here. Okay, so the little footnote comes from urban sociology, and we have a guy named Claude Fisher, and Claude Fisher talked about something he called critical mass, and he was referring to population size and density. And so he said when population size and density reaches a critical mass, a tipping point, that's the point at which all different kinds of urban institutions could be supported, that you had enough people, to keep different kinds of urban institutions going. Like, for example, different kinds of religious communities, right? But like, let's say as population decreases, it becomes harder and harder and harder to support those institutions, and they begin to sort of fall away, right? So, we all live in Johnstown, right? So, Johnstown had, how many different, ethnic parishes, how many different ethnic churches did Johnstown have at one time? And it had a population that could support, right, all of those churches. But we have been hemorrhaging population, over the last 20 or so years. And as our populations have gone down, what's had to happen? Well, these churches have had to close. They can no longer be supported. So maybe we could think of that as sort of analogous to what Herbert Spencer was describing as dissolution. Okay? All right. So where to next? Here. All right. When Spencer is talking about evolution, he says that both organic, biological, and social populations, aggregates, you would call them, right? Both organic and social aggregates are characterized according to progressive increases in size. All right, so we want to recall Malthus. Malthus talks about the inevitability of population increase, right, in nature. Okay, notwithstanding certain checks on population growth. I'm not going to get into any of that. Okay, and so Spencer, following along, talks about societies and how societies grow, right? That movement toward population growth happens, right? And that populations in society can grow either through, the good old-fashioned way by natural increase, what he would call simple multiplication, which is an idea that he gets from Malthus, but societies grow in other ways too. Societies grow through combination. So maybe we could think of like immigration, right, as part of that process of combination. And those two processes, right, natural or simple multiplication and combination can occur together or they can occur separately. And as increases in size happen, that has to lead to increases in complexity, right? Growth in population leads to the necessity for increases in social complexity, right? So, in other words, growth, social growth, population growth, makes necessary progressive differentiation of structures and functions. So, this is where we get to our whole idea of structural differentiation. So, just remember, think about that analogy we made to embryonic development. That's a process of structural differentiation. And then I have a quote that I want to read that also is describing structural differentiation here. It comes from a sociologist named Louis Kozer, who wrote, among other things, wrote the theory book that I used when I was a lad. And here's what Louis Kozer said about structural differentiation. He said, as society grows, its parts become unlike. Right? As society grows, its parts become unlike. It exhibits increase of structure. The unlike parts simultaneously assume activities of unlike kinds, right? So the unlike parts simultaneously assume activities of unlike kinds. This is just another way of saying that they specialize in their function. The function of the government is very different than the function of the family. They have assumed activities of unlike kinds. Let me continue Kozer. Kozer goes on to say this. These activities are not simply different, but the differences are so related as to make one another possible. The differences are so related as to make one another possible. They become interdependent. The function of one depends on the other functioning the way it does. Louis Kozer continues. The reciprocal aid thus given causes mutual dependence of parts, and the mutually dependent parts living by and for another. Let me start that again because I don't want to stammer over it, right? Kozer says, and the mutually dependent parts living by and for another form an aggregate constituted on the same general principle as an individual organism. Society is like an organism.